So we've gone all the way from Earth to the moon, but our next presenter has tied all of these pieces together in a much better way than I have, as part of an entire report that's available to download right now, titled GHG Monitoring from Space, a mapping of capabilities across public, private, and hybrid satellite missions. This report on greenhouse gas monitorings from space includes info from Planet and NASA that Tara and Michael just mentioned, as it covers public, private, and hybrid missions. It is the first systemic global assessment of these capabilities. And we're thrilled to have one of the authors of that report here with us to explore this significance. The report has multiple authors, but Barbara Ryan, the Executive Director at World Geospatial Industry Council, WGIC, is especially suited to talk through these connections. She's a strong advocate for open data policies, the integration of Earth observations, and hyper-partnering to ensure that existing and planned resources can be more effectively used to address this major environmental and social issues facing the world today. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Ryan.
Well, thanks, Jeremiah. I appreciate that introduction. And also, each of the previous speakers, you guys did a great job. And I think during the discussion, we'll have an opportunity to weave a lot of that together. As Jeremiah said, I did want to talk about this report because it was an outgrowth of a high-level dialogue that we participated in with the Group on Earth Observations out of Geneva, Switzerland, Al Gore's former Vice President Al Gore's Climate Trace Initiative and their managing partner or project lead called Watt Time, and of course WGIC. And it is a mapping of capabilities across public, private, and what emerged during the results of that study was that there are hybrid missions that we didn't know about before this study. So you can download the report at that particular website. I don't expect you to read that table on the left-hand side, but what you will see is that it's a limited scope of analyses. It's only the three gases that are recognized by UNFCCC and the Conference of the Parties that have an impact on climate change or emissions. So it's carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So we limited the scope to just those three greenhouse gases across public and private missions, 33 identified missions. You'll see still bulk of them on the public side, 7 in total on the private side, 1 in orbit, that's GHG, actually 2 in orbit, GHG SAT and Orbital Sidekick. Orbital Sidekick is still not delivering data, there's in a testing phase. GHG SAT is delivering data. And then of course hybrid missions that are shown here as 5. So you can go into the report and look at all of that. Let's look at some of the findings because I think it's really quite remarkable. So what you'll see here is that blue missions are what's shown in blue are public missions, private missions are shown in red, and then hybrid missions are shown in gray. And so if we look just at those sheer missions that are in orbit or in development, or in fact one public sector mission that has its end of life, you will see that in orbit, still predominantly public sector missions, with the 2 that I mentioned in the private sector that are in orbit. But when we look at what's in development, you'll see kind of a nice balance between public sector, private sector, and hybrid missions. Let's take that same data and look at it by decades. So in the 1990s to the 2000s, and the 2000s to the 2010s, 100% of the missions were public sector missions. As soon as we got into 2011 to 2020, what you started to see was the introduction of the private sector coming into this trade space. And then as we look out from 2021 to 2030, you'll see the emergence of hybrid missions. So those hybrid missions are some combination of public sector funding, private sector funding, or in a couple cases, philanthropic funding. So that's the graph. Let's look at that same data, but by gas type and or application area. And so again, for CO2, you'll see the public sector emissions are shown in blue, for methane, and then for nitrous oxide. If we come over to the kind of global scale, so point source analyses, national or global, you'll see kind of a nice mix for point source is public, private, and hybrid. And, if you paid attention to Tara's presentation, what you saw with companies like Planet are coming in with much higher resolution spatial data, and so you see that manifest itself with those point source scales. National, still, of course, some of those private sector companies are coming in, as are the hybrid missions, and then still largely at the global scale, it's the domain of the public sector. It kind of reminds me a little bit, if anybody's ever taken a Greyhound or a Trailways bus, this will date me, obviously, across the United States, they advertise that they go anywhere. What they don't tell you is that they go everywhere. So you get on a highway, every 3 miles, you're pulling off the road to another location. This story is like that. Many of those private sector missions have the capability to, in fact, collect data anywhere. Maybe not right at the poles, like we actually saw in Michael's presentation for the moon, but they have the capability. They just don't routinely collect that data globally. And then, of course, if you want to look at that same data by country, you'll see this scan. So United States still quite high with both the combination of public sector, private sector, and hybrid missions. A couple key messages from the report are that clearly all of the satellite information can in fact help calibrate this particular issue. Government space agencies certainly have the capability to collect this data. We need to start acknowledging the contributions that the private sector can make, and also because they are speedily entering into the market. The hybrid models are, again, something we didn't expect to see until we did this analysis. And then I think when Jeremiah mentioned the importance of, or my commitment to hyper-partnering, we absolutely need more collaboration, innovation, and financing. It's not just that those public sector missions continue to need financing from their governments. Those private sector entities also need continued financing if we want to leverage the capabilities of both of these assets. And then clearly new opportunities are arising for secondary remote sensing measurements. And I skipped over open data. While the public, if you are a public sector agency, your satellites were built, your measuring stations were built with taxpayer money. That data needs to be broadly and openly available to everyone. It's an indirect benefit that accrues from those censoring capabilities. Clearly, the private sector has a different business model, but what we are seeing, and I think Tara again mentioned this with the Norway example, there are private sector companies that are taking some part of their assets and opening it up for additional research. Those efforts should be continued. I can say that this was the first time that I think in any kind of coordinated way, assets from the private sector got some visibility at the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. There is no coordinating function for the private sector. Of course, that's the role we, WGIC, served in this capability and would like to serve in the future. The public sector has had some wonderful mechanisms, the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, that have collected this data from public space agencies for decades. That's how that public sector data got in. This was the first time that any coordinated fashion of the private sector was done, and this was just for those 3 greenhouse gases. If you want to, in fact, complete the vision that you've heard actually from each of the speakers this morning, you've got to broaden this effort to all the other constituents that can be observed from space and certainly have an impact on climate, on assessing the Earth's climate. So, just real quickly, we are a global not-for-profit trade association, but you must be a private sector entity to join. We'd love to talk to you. I would love to talk to you off-site, the stage if you are a private sector company. We've got just a couple strategic goals. Certainly strengthen the contributions that the private sector can make to not only the global economy, but to society at large. We advance global policy matters. In fact, there was reference to a digital twin work and how important it is. I think it was Chris that talked about it. We've got a digital twin report coming out in the next 2 months that I would encourage you to take a look at. And of course, because we work on behalf of the private sector, we're looking to increase business opportunities for our members, both within the tent or outside the tent. Our members are here, many on this slide. Many of them are exhibiting here at Geo Week. And again, thank you very much, and I'll look forward to the discussion. Jeremiah.